The central hall of the Union Core Station stretched wider than any human-built structure and towered with crystalline beams that hummed with energy, each one shaped by thousands of years of alien advancement, their artistry woven with power and control. Beneath the silver-blue glow of the ceiling hovered the Council Ring, a levitating disk, where delegates from every major species across the galaxy took their places in silence. They floated in rows, their eyes or equivalents fixed on the lone figure standing below on the presentation floor. He stood tall, not because he wanted to stand out, but because Earth demanded it, because he had not come to kneel. His name was Rain, a former soldier now assigned as Earth's representative in the first direct audience with the ruling chamber of the Galactic Union. Around him, the air vibrated with whispers, translated across 100 languages, through microscopic implants, but Rain ignored the chatter. He looked up at them all and waited. The way he had waited in trenches back on Earth, waiting for the storm to break. The speaker floated forward, a Thalrex official whose species dominated the central seats of power. Their forms were long and smooth, with scales that shimmered in shades of metal. Their voice rang clear and cold across the chamber, welcoming Earth to the Union in a tone that carried no welcome, only command. Rain had been warned about them. The Thalrex believed in order above all else, and anything chaotic, unpredictable, or emotional was to be managed, controlled, or destroyed, and they saw humans as dangerously emotional. Rain listened without moving as the speaker began listing terms with perfect politeness that barely masked the cruelty behind them. Earth would be allowed limited planetary sovereignty, but would surrender all orbital space and deep space defense infrastructure under Union guidance. Earth's military would be disbanded, and its research facilities would be audited by Union observers. All advanced development would be redirected to peaceful purposes, and human ships would require transponder keys assigned by the Union to enter interstellar lanes. It went on and on, each sentence a noose around the neck of a proud world behind Rain. The holographic screens displayed serene images of Earth's oceans, forests, and cities, but he knew what they didn't show. They didn't show the price paid during first contact, when Earth had first encountered Union scouts years ago. Disease had swept in, not out of malice, but ignorance. Technological plagues carried by automated probes. Entire cities had gone dark while Earth scientists scrambled to understand how to fight something they couldn't see. And after the probes came traitors, not the peaceful kind, but those who sought to take rare minerals from Earth in exchange for shiny distractions, selling power in pieces to the desperate. Rain remembered it all. He had lost people during those years, not to war, but to quiet collapse and recovery. Had taken everything. Humans had only just begun to rebuild their world, and now the Union wanted to hand Earth a collar shaped like cooperation. A minor delegate from the Andari species whispered to another that the Deathworlder looked calm, too calm, probably drugged, but he wasn't drugged. He was calculating every word, every breath, every moment, because he knew this meeting would be recorded and replayed across stars, and what he said or didn't say would shape how the Kingwa galaxy saw Earth, not just now but for generations to come. He kept his expression still, his jaw tight, but his fists had slowly clenched behind his back. A habit from his soldier days. The Thalrex speaker continued, explaining that Earth's culture would be welcomed into the Union provided it was adjusted to fit Union norms. Their education systems would be remodeled, their languages would be translated and archived, and their art, their history, their beliefs all reinterpreted through a Union-approved framework for galactic harmony. Rain looked up and saw rows of alien eyes watching him with expectation. Most assumed Earth would say yes. Earth would sign like all new species did, quietly, gratefully, and accept the supervision that followed. Some even believed humans would thank them for the chance to join the so-called peace that had been shaped by centuries of submission, not unity. A moment passed as the Thalrex speaker floated back into position and offered the ceremonial seal. It was a symbol pressed digitally into the air between them, waiting for Rain's acceptance. The air felt thick, the silence heavier than before, and stepped forward, his boots making a sound that echoed across the marble-like floor, each step deliberate. Unhurried, the way he had walked once through a ruined battlefield after an orbital strike, the delegates leaned in, curious, expecting a nod, maybe a prepared statement of compliance. But he did not speak yet, not until he stood directly beneath the seal where the light from above cast him as a single upright shadow. He looked at the symbol hovering there, glowing gold and silver. It spun slowly, as if taunting him, offering a clean chain he could wrap around Earth's throat in the name of peace. He took a deep breath, not because he was nervous, but because he wanted to remember what the air smelled like in this place. This engineered hall of power, where no wind blew and no dust moved, where the truth had been buried under layers of polite oppression for longer than Earth had even had cities. Then he looked up again, not just at the seal, but at every being watching him. And he held their gaze, and still he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence itself had weight, and he knew how to use it. And in that silence something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet stillness of a man refusing to bow. And that was when it began, not the speech, not the rebellion, not the war, but the first true moment of defiance that cracked the mask the Union had worn for so long. The crack was small, but it was there, and for the first time, the stars took notice. The chamber remained still, no movement, no sound, no shift in the air, though thousands of minds processed the moment in real time, and still they waited, as Rain stood unmoving below the hovering seal that represented surrender in all. But named the Thalrex speaker's expression had not changed, but a thin wave of unease moved through the delegates of lesser species. They had seen many diplomats bow with elaborate words. Many races eager to please or desperate to survive had grasped the seal without hesitation, smiling through the pain of compromise. But this man, this human, was doing nothing at all. Rain kept his hands by his sides, not clenched now, but steady. He was not thinking about the politics above him, nor the ships waiting in orbit, nor even the reporters from neutral worlds who watched the transmission from behind layers of diplomatic shielding. He was thinking about his sister, who had died in the first year of contact, a systems engineer who had been exposed to synthetic mold from an alien cargo ship that had not been properly sterilized. He had watched her wither over weeks. As Earth's medicine failed to understand the strange infection, he'd held her hand at the end and promised her that humans would not be forgotten, not broken, not bought. The Thalrex speaker spoke again, calmly, firmly, repeating the offer not as a suggestion, but as a confirmation, as though the silence was simply a delay in translation, not defiance, as though Rain had not heard it right and would correct himself if given another chance. The voice rolled across the chamber, outlining again the kindness of the Union, the protection it would offer, the stability it guaranteed, the opportunity for Earth to participate in a new age of progress and peace, with nothing but obedience in return. Rain tilted his head slightly, not much, but enough for the closest cameras to catch it, a gesture so human, so casual, that it unsettled the nearest watchers. A ripple moved again across the chamber, not of fear, not yet, but of discomfort, as if they sensed something was out of place, something that did not fit the pattern they had known for generations. In the viewing halls above the chamber, other species watched in silence: the merchants, the neutral traders, the historians who documented galactic events. They had seen the Thalrex absorb dozens of planets without force, simply with contracts and ceremonies and declarations. And always the new arrivals accepted, always they folded into the system because survival demanded it. But this time something was different. Rain lifted his eyes and looked across the rows of delegates, not just the Thalrex, but the lesser seats, those assigned to fringe worlds, those who had little voice in the council. He saw them and let them see him, not a weapon, not a fool, not a savage, but a human standing alone by choice. And that image did more than any words could have done in that moment, because the weak knew what it meant to be alone, and they had long forgotten the taste of standing up. The Thalrex speaker's tone sharpened ever so slightly. A note of irritation creeping in behind the smooth presentation. Again he asked for confirmation of the agreement again. He pointed out that refusal would lead to the immediate suspension of Earth's provisional status again. He reminded Rain that Earth's vessels were still outside the Union's patrol lines and could be intercepted within hours, and again he spoke with the certainty of a species that had not been refused in centuries. Rain breathed slow and deep, and finally spoke not with anger, not with threat, but with a voice firm enough to carry through the artificial stillness of the hall. His words did not rush, they flowed with clarity, each syllable shaped with purpose. And wait, he said he had listened to the Union's offer. He said he had understood the conditions, the expectations, the boundaries laid out for Earth, and then without hesitation, he said the word that would change the balance of the chamber, and ripple far beyond it. He said no. There was no shout, no thunder, no violence in the air, but it felt as if a wall had cracked somewhere. Deep beneath the marble floor, the soundless shiver of a system being challenged. The Thalrex speaker blinked once, then again, then turned to the presiding officials for verification, as if something had glitched in the translation feed, but it had not glitched, and every being in the room knew. Etrain stepped forward by half a pace, not enough to be seen as aggression, but enough to make his presence larger, more undeniable. He said Earth would not sign away its right to decide its path, that Earth had not survived Ice Age's wars, collapse and rebirth, only to be told how to live by species that had not set foot on real soil for 1,000 years. He said Earth remembered its pain, and that memory was not a weakness, it was armor. The chamber stirred quietly. Some leaned back, some leaned forward, a few glanced sideways at neighbors, unsure of what was allowed. Now the silence had changed. It was no longer a waiting silence, it had become a listening one. Rain looked directly at the Thalrex speaker, and said that humans were not looking for war, but would not pretend peace was real if it was built on silence and obedience. He said the stars did not belong to the Union alone, that the sky was not owned, and that Earth would claim its own corner without asking permission above him. The hovering seal flickered once, the diplomatic software waiting for biometric confirmation. Now confused by lack of input, the Thalrex delegate reached forward as if to disable it, but then withdrew, sensing that gesture might be interpreted poorly. Everything was being recorded. Every frame, every twitch, every breath. The broadcast would spread within hours, and already watchers across minor worlds were uploading their own interpretations. Rain turned slightly and looked toward the exit, but did not move. He waited, letting the room absorb the weight of his refusal. He knew retaliation could come instantly, but also knew the Union had grown lazy, relying on routine and expectation, and nothing about this moment fit their routine. Far away in Earth's orbit, the fleet waited, silent, unannounced, shadowed behind lunar fields and magnetic fog. Not an army, but a shield, not pointed outward, but held up in defense, their signals dark, but ready. Rain did not speak again. He had said what needed saying, and the silence that followed now belonged to them, to the watchers, to the judges, to the ones who thought a single man could not tilt the balance of an empire. And he stood there, not as a symbol, not yet, but as a beginning, the moment Rain said no. The entire core chamber seemed to hesitate, as if the ancient systems that kept the station breathing could not accept what had just been spoken. The glowing seal that hovered above dimmed ever so slightly, the light unsure if it should remain or vanish. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was heavy, restless, layered with unspoken tension, the kind that exists just before something powerful moves, and once it moves nothing ever remains the same. Thalrex delegate slowly tilted its head, the movement graceful, but cold, its eyes fixed on Rain, as if trying to determine whether this was madness or strategy. It had never faced refusal, not from a new world, not from a species ranked as unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Thalrex ruled not by force alone, but through structure and expectation, and now that structure had cracked with a single word. Rain stood tall, unblinking, surrounded by voices that whispered, but did not speak aloud. His message had already Spread through the chamber, through the observers, and across the watching networks, the decision to say no had been his alone, but its consequences would not remain his alone. He knew what it meant, he knew the risks. He had seen the simulations, the predictions, the reports from Earth's secret council that had warned him about what might happen, and still. He had said it. Behind him one of the lesser delegates, a small gray-skinned being from a low-gravity moon, leaned to its neighbor and muttered something quiet enough that only a sensitive mic would pick it up, and it was not a curse or a warning, it was a hope. It was the first time that being had seen someone say no in that room, and survive for more than a breath. Thalrek's delegate finally spoke again, its voice now stripped of the polished courtesy replaced by a firm emphasis. Precise tone. It reminded Rain that Earth had not been invited into the Union out of fear but generosity. It said that history showed what happened to species that resisted integration. It said that the Union had brought peace, stability, and long-term survival to countless worlds, and Earth was now dangerously close to becoming a problem that required containment. Rain did not flinch, he did not argue. He simply raised his wrist and pressed the small embedded switch just beneath the skin. A pulse, invisible to most, shot upward into the satellites that watched the edge of the Union's authority, and within seconds, several screens across the chamber shifted from Council data to a direct stream. The view was not Earth, it was space. It was a section of deep orbit where no registered fleets were meant to be stationed, and yet there they were. Shadowed ships, sleek and quiet, positioned in silent formation, just beyond the safe boundary of Union patrols. They were not large in number, but they were coordinated, marked by a new design that no one outside Earth had seen before. Rain let them watch, let them count, let them realize what it meant. Earth had not come alone, Earth had not come blind. Earth had come with its own answer to diplomacy. And it was not a threat but a shield. The reaction was immediate. A wave of voices spread through the Council delegates. Stood others, whispered into coms one or two, even began demanding emergency review. The Thalrex remained still, though its eye ridges narrowed. It accused Rain of deception, of aggression, of violating the spirit of the summit. But Rain responded in calm, level words. He said, Earth had not fired a weapon, had not crossed a line, had not sent a fleet to attack, but only to observe. He said the Union had expected Earth to kneel, and Earth had chosen to stand, and standing did not require permission. Another screen flickered, and now it showed not just Earth ships but signals from minor colonies that had gone dark for years. Colonies once free but silenced by trade restrictions or cultural suppression, and now small signs of life returned. Encrypted messages from places the Union had long forgotten, and they were not loud but they were clear. They had heard the human say no, and something in them had awakened. Rain turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep the chamber. Once more, not in arrogance, but in warning, he said, Earth would not be the last to stand. He said submission was not peace, and silence was not harmony, and survival did not require obedience. He said fear had kept many silent, but courage was contagious, and the day would come when defiance would spread like fire through dry grass. The Thalrex issued a formal citation, a prelude to sanctions, a declaration of disobedience. Protocol to be enforced by regional forces, but even as it spoke, the chamber did not move. The authority it claimed no longer echoed with the same force. Something had changed, not in law, not in rules, but in perception, and perception was power. Rain looked up at the central light above the seal, now barely glowing, and he spoke once more, not with fury, but with finality. He said, Earth would defend itself, Earth would walk its path, Earth would no longer trade freedom for favors or sovereignty for safety. He said Earth was not a threat until provoked, and now it had been provoked. One of the neutral delegates finally stood, a representative from the isolated Arcana worlds, a species known for silence and observation, not action, and the delegate spoke briefly in the common tongue. It said, perhaps it was time to rethink the meaning of unity. It said maybe strength was not measured by how many followed, but how many could stand, and that was all, but it was enough to spark another voice. Then Another until half a dozen minor species spoke not in rebellion, not in alliance, but in recognition. Rain said nothing more. He did not smile. He did not bow. He stood while the seal above him flickered and then shut down entirely. The system had no protocol for defiance, only compliance, and now it had nothing to process. And in that moment, as the delegates watched the last light fade from the seal, they began to understand that this was not just a failed treaty. It was not just an act of resistance. It was a turning point, and the stars that had long remained silent now waited to see which voice would rise next. The council chamber no longer felt like a place of order. It now carried weight, like a room where the rules had changed, but no one dared admit it. The silence remained heavy, but it was no longer the silence of discipline. It was the silence that followed a storm that had not yet struck, but had already pulled apart the clouds. Rain stood at the center, not like a victor, not like a rebel, but like a man who had spoken the truth in a room that had forgotten what truth even looked like. Above the council station, orbiting just beyond the visibility shields, the Earth fleet held its place. No weapons activated, no signals of aggression, but every ship gleamed under reflected starlight, each one built in secret, far from Union eyes, designed not for conquest but for survival. Silent, fast, armored, and patient. The ships did not challenge the Union patrols, yet the message they carried was louder than any broadcast. Earth was not alone, Earth was not unprepared, and Earth would not kneel. Again the Thalrax delegation retreated into private chambers, their graceful forms vanishing behind security fields. Not out of fear, but calculation. Their kind had ruled the inner systems for generations, not because they were loved, but because they controlled the flow of knowledge, trade, and fear. They knew how to contain problems, how to turn rebellion into warnings, how to crush threats before they spread. But this human, this Rain, had refused to play by their scripts, and that made him dangerous. Not because he had firepower, but because he had inspired attention. In the outer halls, the buzz had begun. Low voices, private messages, scrambled calls to homeworlds. Small exchanges between representatives who had watched the moment and felt something shift. No fleet had fired, no law had changed, and yet the shape of power had tilted ever so slightly, enough to make the powerful lean forward and the quiet ones look up. For the first time in years, Rain walked slowly from the center of the hall, not escorted, not removed, simply done. He had spoken, he had refused, he had revealed enough to let them understand that Earth was ready, and then he had let silence do the rest. No guards stopped him, no alarm sounded. The rules of diplomacy still held on the surface, but below the surface everything was unsettled. He returned to his chamber high in the Union Tower, where human staff waited, nervously watching the live feed, still replaying his refusal across minor channels. They asked if retaliation had begun, but Rain only shook his head and looked out across the stars from the wide crystal window. He knew it would not come immediately. The Union did not strike in anger. They struck when certainty allowed it, when the odds were fixed, when outcomes were controlled. But he had removed their certainty, and for now that made them cautious. Back on Earth, the world watched in unified silence, the speech broadcast through underground channels, civil networks, and hidden satellites. The reaction was not panic, it was pride, not the pride of conquest, but the deep breath of a people who had waited for someone to speak what they all felt. Earth had come far, rebuilt after the first contact disasters, restructured its alliances, hidden its new technologies behind old names, developed defense not for domination, but so that it could speak without fear. And now it had spoken. Rain opened a private connection to command, his voice calm, his words brief. He confirmed status, gave no extra detail. He knew surveillance was everywhere. He simply said Earth's position had been made clear, and that the response would not be swift, but it would come, and they must be ready. The reply was equally simple, a quiet message from Earth's Defense Command stating only that readiness was constant. Far across the stars and corners of the Union, long ignored small signals began to light up, not in protest but in curiosity. Minor species that had once tried to speak but were silenced by trade restrictions or cultural editing now began to exchange hidden data stories, memories, fragments of their own forgotten resistance. They watched the humans speak, and saw not a threat, but a possibility. They began to wonder if silence was still their only option. Meanwhile, the Thalrex began to move with their usual quiet precision. Meetings were called in shadowed rooms. Orders passed without records. Old enforcers awakened, not yet sent, only prepared. They would not attack Earth directly, not yet, but they would test its reach. Apply pressure in distant systems, disrupt trade with Earth's allies, plant doubts among its new observers. They would not start a war, but they would try to shape the field before the next move. Rain remained where he was, watching the stars, waiting, not because he expected a strike, but because he knew pressure would come, and it would come where Earth was not strong enough to respond directly. He had seen it before, not with stars, but with politics. Pressure, not to destroy, but to break the will. To isolate the defiant and force them back into silence without lifting a weapon. Earth had planned for that too, its diplomats already reaching out through informal lines to species on the edge of the Union, not with promises of power, but with promises of listening, real dialogue, real exchange, not controlled by Union frameworks. Already meetings were forming between minor worlds, not officially sanctioned, but growing in frequency and courage. Earth was building something, not an empire, but a web, a network of those who no longer trusted the old rules and were ready to risk new ones. And as Rain looked out at the sky from the Union Tower, he did not see himself as the spark of a revolution or the symbol of rebellion. He saw himself as a door opened, a single point where the air had changed, and now others would have to decide whether they would walk through or wait for the door to close. Again, back in the council hall, the glowing seal still hovered above the now empty center. Dim and faded its programming, unsure of what to display next, and in that uncertainty was the beginning of something far greater than one human's refusal. It was the beginning of questions, and once questions began in a system built on obedience, they could not easily be silenced again, and the stars beyond the window remained unchanged in light, but not in meaning. They now carried the echo of a word that had not been spoken in that hall for centuries, and that word had not been whispered, or hidden or softened. It had been declared, and it had made the stars tremble. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not peaceful. Silence stretched across Union space, not because all was calm, but because no one knew what would come next. And that uncertainty was more powerful than any weapon. The message of Rain's refusal had spread farther than anyone had expected, carried through back channels, echoed in encrypted transmissions, dissected in quiet halls where leaders met without the presence of their Thalrex overseers. It was discussed not just as an act of rebellion, but as something rare, something forgotten, something that had once existed in the early days of the Union before control replaced conversation. Rain remained in the tower under high observation. Though no charges were filed and no formal expulsion came, the Union chose to wait. They thought perhaps Earth would recall him, perhaps Earth would apologize, perhaps Earth would send someone new, someone more willing, someone who understood how things were supposed to be. But Earth sent no one else, and Rain did not leave. His presence alone was a challenge every breath he took beneath the Union sky, a quiet reminder that Earth had not accepted the order of things. In the outer regions, ships began to move, not in fleets, not in battles, but in quiet formations. Vessels from allied systems rerouted their patrols, adjusted their trade paths, made small deliberate gestures that could be explained away as coincidence, but everyone watching knew they were not coincidence. They were decisions shaped by the ripple that Rain had started. One voice had been enough to make the sky seem different, and now others were finding their own voice, not to shout, not to declare, but to say, we are watching, and we are no longer afraid. The Galactic Council moved, as it always did, slow, deliberate, silent from the outside, but relentless within. They began to adjust policies on Earth-sanctioned partnerships, reviewed trade entries, flagged for compliance. Their networks spread into commercial zones. Legal divisions and communication monitors. They did not launch ships, they launched pressure, and they expected Earth to bend under it, as so many had before, but Earth had prepared. Earth had seen what came before, and had shaped itself for this moment, not for war, but for resistance, not to attack, but to endure. Earth's economy shifted, alliances hardened, resource lines rerouted, and when the first embargo arrived, Earth simply continued its operations through older paths, slower but functional, using knowledge passed from one generation to the next, the kind of knowledge that came from surviving alone for centuries before any Union existedrain received updates. Through hidden links, not direct messages, but fragments encoded in routine diplomatic reports, he read between the lines, understood the tempo, felt the momentum, not collapsing, but building. Earth had not backed down, and now others were stepping forward. Not with weapons, not yet, but with questions. Questions about the balance of power, about the promise of peace, about the silence that had lasted too long. One moon in the Ziran quadrant held a vote previously forbidden. Their decision was simple. They would no longer filter cultural broadcasts through the Union Review Board. They would tell their stories as they remembered them, not as they were instructed to remember. The vote passed narrowly, but it passed, and the broadcast that followed was watched by billions, not for its quality, but for its meaning. A voice that had once been edited, now heard in full. Elsewhere, a group of scientists from a minor water world began publishing their research without submitting it to the Central Union Registry. They did not hide, they did not apologize. They simply said the truth should not require permission, and in that truth was a spark of fire that had waited too long beneath the surface. Arain was summoned once more to the council chamber, not to apologize but to explain. He stood again in the same place where he had first refused, but now the hall did not carry the same weight. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt one-sided. There was listening now, not just watching. The Thalrex delegate questioned him, asked if Earth's refusal meant war, if it meant isolation, if it meant Earth no longer believed in peace. Arain answered not with defiance, but with clarity. He said peace built on silence was not peace. He said unity built on control was not strength. He said Earth did not seek chaos, Earth sought choice. Earth wanted to speak without being punished for its voice. And if the Union could not allow that, then the Union was not as strong as it believed itself. Debatey Hall remained quiet after he finished, but this time there were no immediate demands, no threats, no citations, just quiet, as if even the oldest delegates were thinking, not reacting, not deciding yet, but thinking, and that was more than Rain had hoped for. He returned to his chamber that night and looked once more across the stars. They had not changed in color or shape, but they carried new meaning now. Every point of light was a question, waiting to be asked, a possibility waiting to be tested. He knew Earth's path would not be easy, but it would be theirs, and that mattered more than comfort or permission. News from Earth spoke of growing unity among its nations. New agreements formed, not by fear of attack, but by shared purpose. The people had seen what one voice could do, and they had chosen not to turn away. They had chosen to build on it. Each city, each colony, each spaceport, now lit not just by progress, but by pride. Not the pride of being stronger, but the pride of being free. And in distant systems, others began to write new treaties, not in defiance of the Union, but in recognition of themselves. They wrote with their own words, shaped their own meanings, began to decide how they would stand, who they would become. Not all at once, not everywhere, but it had begun, and once it begins, it cannot be undone. Arain stayed in the tower for many weeks more, not as a prisoner, not as a guest, but as a witness. He watched the Union learn to hear again. He watched the stars tremble, not with fear, but with change. He stood not because he wanted to be remembered, but because the moment had needed someone to stand, and in time when the history was told not just on Earth, but in a dozen other worlds, it was not told as a war, not told as a rebellion, it was told as a beginning. The day someone said no, not with anger, not with hate, but with truth, and the Galaxy learned that sometimes one word is enough to shake the stars. The end.